The ballroom went silent. Not because she arrived, but because of who arrived with her. Her ex-husband stood frozen. The same man who had laughed when she lost everything. The same man who told everyone she would never recover. The same man who sent this invitation hoping she'd be embarrassed in front of hundreds of people. Instead, she stepped out of a black luxury car. And what happened next left an entire room speechless. But this story isn't really about money. It's about what happened after she lost everything. And why the invitation he mailed 6 months earlier became the biggest mistake of his life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Most people believe betrayal begins with a lie. They're wrong. It usually begins with an assumption. An assumption about someone's worth. An assumption about someone's future. An assumption that the person standing beside you today will always need you tomorrow. And that was exactly the mistake Ethan Walker made. As he stood in that ballroom surrounded by relatives, business partners, and longtime friends, he thought he had already won. He believed the story was over. The struggling wife had been left behind. The successful husband had moved on. The wealthy man was about to celebrate his success in front of everyone who mattered. At least, that's what he thought. What he didn't know was that the woman walking through those doors wasn't the same woman he divorced 6 years earlier. The woman he remembered was exhausted, heartbroken, trying to raise 2 children while rebuilding a life that had been torn apart. The woman approaching him now was something entirely different. And the truth she had hidden for nearly a decade was about to turn his world upside down. Because years earlier, when Ethan first met Claire Bennett, he thought he knew exactly who she was. A quiet woman from a modest background. A woman with simple dreams. A woman who worked long hours and rarely talked about her family. A woman who seemed grateful for everything he gave her. But there was one thing Claire never told him. One secret she protected from the very beginning. A secret so large that if Ethan had known it on the day they met, he probably would have never treated her the same way. And if he had known it before filing for divorce, he might have spent every day afterward regretting the decision. Because while Ethan spent years chasing wealth, status, and recognition, Claire had been born into something most people only dream about. The question is, why would someone hide a fortune? Why would someone choose an ordinary life when they could have anything they wanted? And how did the woman everyone pitted become the person everyone envied? To answer that, we have to go back nearly 3 decades. Back to a small college campus in Virginia. Back to a chance meeting that looked like the beginning of a love story. And back to the moment Claire Bennett made a decision that would eventually cost her almost everything. At the time, Ethan seemed like the kind of man anyone would trust. Ambitious, charming, confident. The kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with a dozen new friends. People admired him. They listened when he spoke. They believed him. Claire did too. And in the beginning, there was no reason not to. They fell in love quickly. Or at least, that's how it appeared. Within a few years they were married. Soon after, they welcomed 2 children into the world. From the outside, their life looked picture perfect. A growing family. A beautiful home. A successful husband. A devoted wife. But appearances have a way of hiding things. And behind closed doors, small cracks were already beginning to form. Cracks that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Cracks that started with one dangerous belief. Ethan thought he was the reason their life was successful. And over time, he began to forget who had been standing beside him from the very beginning. What happened next would set off a chain of events that neither of them could have imagined. And it all began with a friendship Claire trusted more than anyone. Who was Claire Bennett before the divorce? That depends on who you ask. To some people, she was simply Ethan Walker's wife. The quiet woman who stayed in the background while her husband built his reputation. The devoted mother raising 2 children while keeping her family together. The woman everyone assumed would always be there. But assumptions can be dangerous, especially when they're built on appearances. Because the version of Claire that Ethan thought he knew was only part of the story. The truth was far more complicated. And years later, when that truth finally came to light, it would leave an entire family questioning everything they thought they knew about her. Then there was Ethan. Why was he so determined to show off? Why would a man who had already moved on spend months making sure his ex-wife received an invitation to an event she clearly wasn't expected to attend? At first glance, it seemed simple. Success, pride, ego. But people rarely go to that much effort unless they're trying to prove something. The real question wasn't why Ethan invited Claire. The real question was why it mattered so much to him that she saw what he had become. And the answer to that question begins years before the invitation ever arrived. Back when Ethan made a decision that he believed would improve his life forever. A decision he celebrated. A decision he never imagined he would regret. Then there's another question. What happened after Claire lost everything? Because from the outside, that's exactly what it looked like. She lost her marriage. She lost the future she thought she was building. She lost friends she had trusted for years. Even some family members quietly assumed she would never recover. Many people expected her story to end there. Most divorce stories do. One person moves forward. The other struggles to keep up. At least that's what everyone believed was happening. What nobody realized was that while Ethan was busy showing the world how successful he had become, Claire was rebuilding her life in complete silence. And silence can be a powerful thing, especially when nobody is paying attention. But perhaps the biggest mystery of all is this. Why did Claire nearly throw the invitation away? When the envelope first arrived, she didn't smile. She didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel curiosity. If anything, she felt exhausted. Just seeing Ethan's name again brought back memories she had spent years trying to leave behind. Memories of betrayal, broken promises, and one friendship that ended in a way she never thought possible. For several minutes, she stared at the envelope without opening it. Then she carried it toward the trash. And if one small detail had been different, this entire story would have ended right there. No reunion. No shocking arrival. No stunned faces in a crowded ballroom. Nothing. But hidden inside that envelope was something nobody else knew. Something Ethan never intended to reveal. Something so unexpected that the moment Claire discovered it, she stopped walking. She read it once, then twice, then a third time, and suddenly, the invitation meant something entirely different. Because buried between the formal words and polished greetings was a detail that would change everything. A detail connected to a secret Ethan had never uncovered during their marriage. A secret Claire had protected for years. And once she saw it, she realized something important. For the first time since the divorce, fate had handed her an opportunity. Not for revenge, not for humiliation, not even for validation, but for something much more powerful. The chance to reveal the truth. And before this story is over, that truth will force Ethan Walker to confront the one thing he spent years refusing to see. The woman he underestimated from the very beginning. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all started. Back before the wealth, before the betrayal, before the divorce. Back to the day Ethan Walker first met Claire Bennett and made an assumption that would eventually cost him everything. Years before the invitation. Years before the divorce. Years before an entire ballroom would fall silent at the sight of Claire Bennett. There was simply a young woman with a hopeful heart and a future she believed she could trust. Claire grew up in a quiet town where people knew one another by name and where character mattered more than appearances. She wasn't the kind of person who demanded attention. She didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. She wasn't interested in impressing anyone. The people who knew her best often described her the same way. Kind, loyal, dependable. The type of person who would give without keeping score. The type of person who would show up when everyone else disappeared. By the time she met Ethan Walker, she had already learned the value of hard work. She understood sacrifice. She understood commitment. And when she fell in love, she approached marriage the same way she approached everything else in life. Wholeheartedly. For Claire, marriage wasn't a contract. It wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a competition. It was a partnership. A promise that two people would build something together. For a long time, she believed that's exactly what she and Ethan were doing. The early years weren't glamorous. There were no luxury vacations, no lavish homes, no expensive cars parked in the driveway. There were bills to pay, long hours to work, and plenty of uncertainty about what the future would bring. But Claire didn't mind, because she believed in Ethan, even when others questioned his ideas, even when his plans failed, even when opportunities slipped away. She stayed. When he wanted to launch his first business venture, and everyone told him it was too risky, Claire stood beside him. When investors turned him down, Claire encouraged him to keep trying. When the stress became overwhelming, Claire carried more of the burden at home so he could focus on his goals. She believed his success would become their success. And for years, she poured herself into that belief. Whenever Ethan needed support, she was there. Whenever he doubted himself, she reminded him why he started. Whenever obstacles appeared, She helped him push through them. When money was tight, Claire picked up additional work. When expenses piled up, she found ways to stretch every dollar. When their children needed attention, she made sure they never felt the pressure their parents were carrying. Many nights, she stayed awake long after everyone else had gone to sleep, balancing budgets, planning schedules, trying to hold everything together. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she loved her family. As the years passed, Ethan's ambitions began producing results. The opportunities became bigger. The business became stronger. The money started arriving. And little by little, the life they had dreamed about seemed within reach. The modest apartment became a larger home. The financial stress eased. The future looked brighter. From the outside, it appeared they had achieved exactly what every young couple hopes for. A successful marriage, healthy children, growing prosperity, a life built through patience and perseverance. And through it all, Claire never asked for recognition. She didn't need applause. She didn't need praise. Seeing her family happy was enough. Or at least she thought it was. Because while Claire was celebrating what they had built together, something had quietly changed inside Ethan. Success has a strange way of revealing a person's character. Some people become grateful. Others become entitled. Some remember the people who stood beside them during the difficult years. Others convinced themselves they succeeded alone. The more Ethan's business grew, the more attention he received. People admired him, complimented him, praised his accomplishments. And somewhere along the way, he began believing he deserved all of it. The recognition, the status, the influence. He enjoyed being viewed as the self-made success story. What he rarely mentioned was the woman who had sacrificed so much to help him get there. Over time, Claire noticed small changes. Nothing dramatic at first. A comment here, a dismissive remark there. Moments that seemed insignificant on their own. Yet together they formed a pattern she couldn't ignore. The man she married was becoming someone she barely recognized. And while Claire believed they were building a future together, Ethan was beginning to imagine a future without her. A future where success mattered more than loyalty. A future where appearances mattered more than character. And a future that included someone else. Someone Claire trusted enough to call a friend. What happened next would destroy everything she thought she knew about her marriage. At first, the changes were easy to explain. At least that's what Claire told herself. After all, Ethan's business was growing faster than ever. More clients, more meetings, more responsibilities. It made sense that he would spend longer hours at work. It made sense that he would travel more often. It made sense that he would come home exhausted. For a while, Claire accepted every explanation he gave her. Because trust doesn't disappear overnight. Trust fades one unanswered question at a time. One strange moment at a time. One uncomfortable feeling at a time. The first sign appeared during dinner. Ethan's phone lit up. He glanced at the screen, then quickly turned it over. A simple gesture, almost meaningless. Yet something about it felt unusual. A few days later, it happened again. And then again. Messages arriving late at night. Calls he suddenly needed to take in another room. Conversations that stopped whenever Claire entered. Whenever she asked about it, Ethan had an answer ready. Business, clients, deadlines, opportunities. The explanations sounded reasonable, but the feeling in Claire's stomach refused to go away. Then came the business trips. At first, they were occasional. Then they became frequent. Sometimes Ethan would leave for several days at a time, sometimes longer. And whenever Claire asked for details, his answers seemed increasingly vague. The confidence he once carried was being replaced by irritation. Questions that never used to bother him suddenly felt like accusations. Simple conversations turned into arguments. Small concerns became major disagreements. Claire found herself apologizing for things she hadn't done, trying to avoid conflicts she didn't understand, trying desperately to hold together something that seemed to be slipping away. Then there was the money. Not enough to create panic. Not enough to attract immediate attention. Just enough to raise questions. Charges she didn't recognize. Withdrawals she couldn't explain. Expenses that didn't make sense. Whenever she asked, Ethan brushed them aside. Business expenses, client entertainment, travel costs. Yet something still didn't add up. The more she looked, the more uneasy she became. But perhaps the most painful part wasn't Ethan's behavior. It was who seemed to be spending more time around them. Madison Reed, Claire's closest friend. A woman she had trusted for years. Someone who attended family dinners. Someone who celebrated holidays with them. Someone her children adored. Madison had become part of their lives long ago. She knew their secrets, their struggles, their victories. Claire never imagined she would have any reason to question her. Why would she? Trust is powerful, and betrayal is most devastating when it comes from someone you never suspected. As months passed, Ethan and Madison seemed to appear in the same conversations more often. The same events, the same trips, the same opportunities. Whenever Claire noticed, she dismissed the thought almost immediately. Because some possibilities are too painful to consider. Some questions feel dangerous even before they're answered. Then one afternoon, everything changed. It happened on an ordinary day, the kind of day people rarely remember. Claire wasn't searching for evidence. She wasn't trying to catch anyone. She wasn't expecting her life to collapse. She simply needed a document Ethan had asked her to retrieve from his office. That's all. A simple task, one she had done dozens of times before. But while searching through a desk drawer, she found something she wasn't supposed to see. At first, it looked harmless. A receipt, then another, then a photograph. And suddenly the pieces began fitting together. The dates, the locations, the unexplained trips, the missing money, the late-night calls, the hidden messages. Every uncomfortable feeling she had spent months ignoring came rushing back at once. Still, even then, Claire hoped she was wrong. She wanted another explanation. Any explanation. Instead, she found proof. Proof that Ethan wasn't simply having an affair. Proof that this wasn't a recent mistake. Proof that this wasn't a moment of weakness. The relationship had been going on for years. Years. While she was raising their children. While she was supporting his dreams. While she was defending him to friends and family. The entire time, Ethan had been living a second life. And the woman beside him wasn't a stranger. It was Madison, her closest friend. The betrayal wasn't hidden in the shadows. It had been sitting at her dinner table, laughing with her children, sharing holidays with her family, looking her in the eyes while keeping a devastating secret. For several minutes, Claire simply stared, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to process what she was seeing. Everything she believed about her marriage suddenly felt uncertain. Everything she believed about her friendship shattered in an instant. The pain wasn't just emotional. It was disorienting. The realization that the people she trusted most had been deceiving her for years left her questioning every memory she had. Every conversation, every smile, every moment she thought was real. When Ethan arrived home that evening, Claire was waiting. The evidence sat on the table between them. There was no point denying it. No point pretending. The truth had already arrived. What followed was an argument neither of them would ever forget. Years of frustration erupted at once. Accusations, confessions, anger, tears, questions that could never be answered satisfactorily. Claire demanded the truth. Ethan offered excuses. Claire wanted honesty. Ethan offered justification. The more he spoke, the worse it became. Because somewhere beneath all the explanations was a belief Ethan had been carrying for years. A belief that cut deeper than the affair itself. He had convinced himself he deserved more. More status, more admiration, more success. And in his mind, Claire no longer fit the life he wanted. The woman who had helped him build everything was now being treated as though she were holding him back. Within months, the marriage collapsed. The separation was ugly. The divorce was worse. Friends chose sides. Family relationships fractured. The children were caught in the middle of a conflict they never asked for. Everything Claire spent decades building seemed to disappear piece by piece. By the time the divorce papers were finalized, she barely recognized her life. The marriage was gone. Her friendship with Madison was gone. The future she once imagined was gone. And yet, as painful as all of that was, it still wasn't the worst part. Because losing her marriage wasn't what nearly destroyed her. What happened during the divorce did. And what Ethan discovered afterward would convince him he had made the greatest mistake of his life. For years, Claire believed the divorce would be the end of the pain. She was wrong. The divorce wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of a completely different battle. A battle she never saw coming. When the paperwork was finalized, Ethan walked away believing he had won. He had the successful business, the public image, the admiration of people who only knew part of the story. And standing beside him was Madison, the woman he had chosen over his wife. Meanwhile, Claire was left trying to rebuild a life she barely recognized. The first few months were the hardest. Not because of the headlines people imagined. Not because of public embarrassment. But because heartbreak has a way of showing up in ordinary moments. Moments nobody else sees. The silence at the dinner table. the empty side of the bed, the absence of routines that once felt permanent. For 27 years, Claire had built her world around her family. Now she was standing in the middle of the ruins trying to figure out what remained. One by one, difficult decisions followed. The house had to go. There was no way around it. Too many memories. Too many expenses. Too many reminders of a life that no longer existed. The day the moving truck arrived felt surreal. Every room told a story. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, family dinners, school projects, late-night conversations. The walls held decades of memories. Now strangers were carrying pieces of that life out the front door. Claire tried to stay strong for the children. But strength becomes difficult when every box feels like another goodbye. As furniture disappeared, the house began looking unfamiliar. Empty spaces appeared where laughter once echoed. Rooms that once felt alive now felt hollow. For the first time, Claire understood that losing a marriage wasn't just losing a person. Sometimes it feels like losing an entire chapter of your identity. Soon afterward, she moved into a much smaller apartment. Nothing luxurious. Nothing impressive. Just enough space for a fresh start. The apartment wasn't what bothered her. It was what it represented. Years earlier, she had helped build a comfortable life. Now she was beginning again from scratch. There were evenings when stacks of unopened bills sat on the kitchen counter. Evenings when she stared at financial statements longer than she wanted to admit. Evenings when anxiety made sleep nearly impossible. For the first time in decades, uncertainty had become a daily companion. Some possessions had to be sold. Others were simply left behind. Things she once treasured suddenly became practical decisions. Each item carried a memory, and each sale felt like another reminder of how much had changed. The hardest part wasn't the financial adjustment. It was the emotional weight attached to it. People often assume resilience means never struggling. The truth is very different. Resilience usually begins with struggle. And there were days when Claire questioned everything. Days when she wondered whether she had missed warning signs years earlier. Days when she replayed conversations in her mind, searching for answers. Days when she blamed herself for mistakes that were never hers to carry. Was she not enough? Had she sacrificed too much? Had she spent so many years helping others succeed that she forgot who she was? The questions followed her everywhere. In grocery store aisles, during long drives, late at night, when the world became quiet. Questions have a way of growing louder when you're alone. The future that once seemed certain had vanished. And for the first time in her adult life, Claire had no idea what came next. Meanwhile, Ethan appeared to be thriving. Social media photos painted a perfect picture. Business achievements, luxury vacations, expensive dinners, smiling faces. To outsiders, it looked like he had moved on effortlessly. And every time Claire saw another glimpse of that life, the wound reopened. Not because she wanted him back, but because she couldn't understand how someone could walk away from decades of loyalty and seem completely unaffected. Months turned into years. Life settled into a routine. Work, children, bills, responsibilities, survival. Claire stopped focusing on what Ethan was doing. Not because she had healed completely, but because she had no choice. She had 2 children depending on her, and every ounce of energy was devoted to making sure they felt secure. Yet beneath the surface, something unexpected was happening. The woman who once relied on others was slowly becoming independent. The woman who once defined herself through her marriage was beginning to rediscover herself. She couldn't see it yet, but the most important transformation of her life had already begun. And strangely enough, it started during one of the lowest points she had ever experienced. One rainy afternoon, after an especially difficult week, Claire found herself sitting alone in a small neighborhood coffee shop. She wasn't looking for answers. She wasn't searching for opportunities. She simply needed a quiet place to think. A place where nobody knew her story. A place where nobody asked questions. That's when a stranger sitting nearby noticed the documents spread across her table. Financial papers. Notes. Ideas she had been scribbling down for weeks. At first, it seemed like an ordinary conversation. The kind people forget within minutes. A few casual questions. A few polite responses. Nothing remarkable. At least that's how it appeared. Because neither of them realized that conversation was about to change the course of Claire Bennett's life forever. And what she heard next would become the first step toward a future nobody saw coming. The stranger's name was Richard Lawson, a semi-retired entrepreneur who had spent decades building and selling businesses. At first, the conversation seemed ordinary. Richard noticed the financial documents spread across Claire's table and asked a simple question. "What are you working on?" Claire almost laughed, because the honest answer was that she wasn't working on anything. She was trying to survive, trying to create a plan, trying to figure out how to move forward. For nearly an hour they talked. About business, about failure, about second chances, about starting over later in life. When Claire mentioned some of the organizational systems she had helped create during Ethan's early business years, Richard became interested. Very interested. Because what Claire viewed as ordinary experience wasn't ordinary at all. For years she had helped build structures, processes, client systems, and growth strategies behind the scenes. She had spent decades solving problems. She simply never received credit for it. Richard saw something Claire couldn't yet see. Value. The following week, he made an unexpected offer. A small consulting project. Nothing life-changing. Nothing guaranteed. Just an opportunity. Claire hesitated. The last few years had shattered her confidence. The idea of advising businesses seemed absurd. Who would listen to her? Who would pay for her expertise? But Richard was persistent. And eventually, Claire agreed. The first project was small. The payment was modest. Yet when it ended, something remarkable happened. The client loved her work. Then they referred her to someone else. And that client referred another. For the first time in years, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. Not dramatic hope. Not life-changing hope. Just enough hope to believe tomorrow might be better than today. The consulting work grew slowly. There were setbacks. Plenty of them. One potential client backed out at the last minute. Another project collapsed after months of preparation. There were weeks when she questioned whether any of it would work. Weeks when she considered giving up entirely. But every time she stumbled, she remembered something. She had already survived the hardest chapter of her life. Failure wasn't nearly as frightening as it used to be. So she kept going. One client became 3. 3 became 8. 8 became 15. Soon she found herself helping small businesses streamline operations, increase profitability, and avoid mistakes she had witnessed throughout her years with Ethan's company. Word spread. Recommendations multiplied. And gradually, Claire's confidence returned. Not the confidence that comes from praise. The confidence that comes from competence. The confidence that comes from earning success one step at a time. Then another opportunity appeared. This one came from a client involved in real estate investments. At first, Claire wasn't interested. The market seemed intimidating. The risks seemed enormous. But after months of conversations and research, she decided to invest a portion of her growing income. The first property wasn't impressive. A small investment. A calculated risk. Nothing more. The returns were modest. But they were real. For the first time, her money was beginning to work for her. Over the next few years, she continued learning, studying, asking questions, building relationships, making careful decisions. Some investments performed well. Others didn't. One project generated excellent returns. Another lost money. There were victories. There were disappointments. There were moments when she questioned her judgment. Yet each experience made her stronger, smarter, more prepared. And unlike before, she wasn't building someone else's future. She was building her own. The years passed faster than she expected. Her consulting company expanded. Her investments grew. New opportunities emerged. More importantly, Claire herself changed. The woman who once doubted every decision now trusted her instincts. The woman who once measured her worth through someone else's approval now understood her own value. She no longer spent time wondering whether Ethan regretted leaving. She no longer cared. Her energy was focused elsewhere. Her future, her children, her goals, her life. The greatest transformation wasn't financial. It was personal. The pain that once defined her story became only one chapter of it. And people began noticing. Friends who had quietly disappeared after the divorce suddenly reappeared. Former acquaintances expressed surprise at how well she was doing. Some even asked how she managed to rebuild after everything she had endured. The answer was simpler than anyone expected. One day at a time. One decision at a time. One opportunity at a time. The woman everyone had counted out was quietly creating a life stronger than the one she lost. And the most remarkable part? Ethan knew almost nothing about it. While Claire focused on growth, Ethan remained convinced that she was still struggling, still recovering, still living in the shadow of their divorce. That assumption would eventually become one of the most expensive mistakes he ever made. Because 6 years after their marriage ended, When Claire had nearly forgotten about the past, something unexpected appeared in her mailbox. A thick ivory envelope. Elegant. Formal. Unexpected. At first, she thought it had been delivered to the wrong address. Then she noticed the return name printed in the corner. Ethan Walker. And the moment she saw it, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years came rushing back. What Claire discovered inside that envelope would set the stage for a reunion nobody would ever forget. And before the night was over, Ethan Walker would learn a truth he should have discovered years earlier. The envelope sat unopened on Claire's kitchen counter for nearly an hour. Not because she was busy, not because she didn't recognize the name, but because some chapters of life are easier left closed. For 6 years, Claire had worked tirelessly to move forward. She had rebuilt her confidence, rebuilt her finances, rebuilt her future. The last thing she wanted was another reminder of the man who had nearly destroyed all three. Yet eventually curiosity won. Slowly, she picked up the envelope and broke the seal. Inside was a thick, cream-colored invitation embossed with gold lettering. At first glance, it looked like a celebration. And it was. Just not the kind Claire expected. Ethan Walker was hosting a lavish gala to celebrate a major milestone. His company had reached a level of success he had spent decades pursuing. The event would bring together family members, business partners, community leaders, and longtime friends. Hundreds of guests were expected to attend. The venue alone cost more than many people earned in a year. Every detail had been designed to impress. Every detail had been designed to communicate one message. Ethan Walker had made it. At least that was the story he wanted everyone to believe. As Claire continued reading, she noticed something unusual. The invitation wasn't generic. It wasn't part of a mass mailing. There was a handwritten note at the bottom. Short, polite, carefully worded. Yet something about it felt personal, almost deliberate, as if Ethan wanted to make absolutely certain she received it. Claire stared at the note for several seconds. Then she set the invitation down. The feeling in her stomach was immediate. This wasn't simply an invitation. It felt like a message, a statement, a reminder. The following week, she received confirmation of that suspicion. It started with a phone call from an old mutual friend, someone who still occasionally crossed paths with Ethan. During their conversation, the topic of the gala came up. Then another detail emerged. Ethan had been talking about the event for months. Not just talking about it, bragging about it, discussing the guest list, discussing the venue, discussing the success of his company, and surprisingly often, discussing Claire. At first, she didn't believe it. Why would Ethan still care what she thought? Why would he spend years building a new life only to remain focused on his former one? But as more conversations occurred, a pattern emerged. Different people repeated similar stories. Ethan was convinced Claire would never attend. Convinced she was still struggling. Convinced she would be too embarrassed to show up. Convinced she wouldn't want anyone seeing what had become of her after the divorce. Some even recalled hearing him joke about it. Nothing cruel enough to attract criticism. Nothing obvious. Just enough to reveal what he believed. That he had won. That Claire had lost. And that everyone else knew it. The assumptions were almost unbelievable. Not because they were inaccurate, but because they revealed how little Ethan actually knew about the woman he had once been married to. For 6 years, he had built an entire narrative in his mind. A narrative where Claire remained frozen in the worst moment of her life. A narrative where she never recovered. A narrative where she never moved forward. And perhaps most revealing of all, a narrative where she still needed his approval. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. Because while Ethan was busy imagining her failure, Claire had been quietly creating a level of success he couldn't even imagine. Yet despite everything she had accomplished, the invitation created a conflict she didn't expect. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to ignore it, to continue living her life without looking back. After all, what was there to gain? The past was the past. The wounds had healed. The lessons had been learned. Attending the gala would only reopen old memories. But another part of her felt differently. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she wanted validation. And certainly not because she wanted to impress Ethan. The feeling was harder to explain. For years, Ethan had controlled the ending of their story. He had decided who stayed, who left, who mattered, who didn't. Maybe attending wasn't about him at all. Maybe it was about proving something to herself. Over the following weeks, Claire changed her mind more times than she could count. One day she was certain she wouldn't go. The next day she considered attending. Then she rejected the idea again. The invitation remained on her desk, as if waiting for a final answer. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And still she hadn't decided. Then something happened. A detail buried within the event schedule caught her attention. A detail connected to Ethan's speech that evening. A detail that made her look twice. Then a third time. Suddenly, the gala wasn't just another celebration. It was something else entirely. And for the first time since receiving the invitation, Claire began to understand why fate had placed it in her hands. 3 days before the event, she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, holding the invitation one final time. For several moments, she said nothing. Then she smiled. A calm smile. A confident smile. The kind of smile that only appears when someone has finally made peace with their past. Because after months of uncertainty, Claire Bennett had reached a decision. She was going to attend. What Ethan didn't know was that his carefully planned celebration was about to become the most unforgettable night of his life. And when Claire finally walked through those ballroom doors, the reaction would be far greater than anyone expected. The evening arrived faster than Claire expected. For months, the invitation had sat quietly in her home. A simple piece of paper carrying the weight of an entire chapter of her life. Now there was no more time to think about it. No more time to reconsider. The night had finally arrived. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, luxury vehicles began filling the parking lot outside the grand ballroom. Business executives, local politicians, investors, family members, longtime friends. The guest list represented nearly every important relationship Ethan Walker had spent years cultivating. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated the enormous hall. Champagne flowed freely. Music drifted through the room. Conversations echoed from every corner. Laughter filled the air. For Ethan, everything appeared perfect. Exactly as he had imagined. Exactly as he had planned. For most of the evening, he moved confidently through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, sharing stories about his company's success. The admiration was everything he had hoped for. Meanwhile, guests continued arriving. Couples entered through the main doors. Families checked in at reception. Old friends reunited. No one suspected the biggest moment of the evening hadn't happened yet. Then, just after 7:30, a black luxury vehicle pulled into the parking area. The driver parked near the entrance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the rear passenger door opened. A woman stepped out. Several people near the entrance glanced in her direction, then looked again. One guest whispered something to another. A second person stopped walking. A third turned around completely. Within seconds, a strange ripple began moving through the crowd. Not panic, not excitement, confusion, recognition, disbelief. Inside the ballroom, conversations continued. Outside, more people were beginning to notice. The woman approaching the entrance looked familiar. Very familiar, yet somehow completely different. The closer she came, the quieter the entrance became. A few guests exchanged uncertain looks. Others simply stared, because standing before them was someone many hadn't seen in years. Claire Bennett. The woman most assumed had disappeared after the divorce. The woman many believed never recovered. The woman Ethan rarely spoke about anymore. At least not publicly. For several moments, people seemed unsure how to react. Claire wasn't dressed extravagantly. There were no dramatic displays. No attempt to attract attention. No effort to dominate the room. Yet somehow she commanded attention anyway. Confidence has a way of doing that, especially when it comes from someone who no longer needs approval. As Claire entered the ballroom, more conversations began fading. One by one, table by table, people noticed. Then more people noticed. Soon entire sections of the room had shifted their attention toward the entrance. The reaction puzzled some guests. Several younger attendees didn't understand why everyone seemed so interested. Others quickly explained. That's Claire, Ethan's ex-wife. The room seemed to pause. Not completely, just enough for people to realize something unusual was happening. Across the ballroom, Ethan continued speaking with a group of investors. At first he didn't notice. Then one of them glanced past his shoulder. Another stopped listening. A third appeared distracted. Ethan turned, and for the first time that evening, he saw Claire. The expression on his face changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough for those closest to him to notice. Because the woman standing near the entrance wasn't the person he expected. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't uncomfortable. She wasn't trying to avoid attention. Most surprising of all, she looked completely at peace. For years, Ethan had imagined what this moment would look like. If she ever attended. If she ever walked into a room filled with people who remembered the divorce. He assumed she would feel awkward, self-conscious, perhaps even intimidated. Instead, she seemed completely unaffected, and that realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Then guests began noticing additional details. The business leaders greeting Claire by name, the investors crossing the room to welcome her, the executives eager to introduce themselves. People Ethan considered influential appeared genuinely excited to see her. The whispers grew louder. Questions spread quickly. How does she know them? When did this happen? What has she been doing all these years? The answers arrived slowly. One conversation at a time. One shocked reaction at a time. Guests learned that Claire's consulting company had become remarkably successful. They learned she held investments in multiple commercial developments. They learned she sat on advisory boards. They learned she had become a respected figure in circles Ethan never realized she occupied. Then came the revelation that truly stunned people. The family fortune. The one she had never discussed. The one she had protected throughout her marriage. The one Ethan had never taken seriously because he never bothered asking enough questions. Years earlier, Claire had quietly inherited substantial ownership interests connected to one of the largest private investment groups in the country. A fortune that dwarfed nearly everything Ethan had spent his life building. Suddenly, the assumptions collapsed. The story everyone thought they knew no longer made sense. The woman many had pitted was wealthier than anyone realized. Far wealthier than Ethan. Yet strangely, Claire didn't appear interested in any of it. She wasn't introducing herself through status. She wasn't discussing money. She wasn't seeking attention. If anything, she seemed focused on something entirely different. Because despite what everyone assumed, Claire hadn't come to prove she was richer. She hadn't come to embarrass Ethan. She hadn't come for revenge. She had come for a reason nobody in that ballroom could possibly imagine. A reason connected to something Ethan had said years earlier. A reason connected to the secret she had protected throughout their marriage. And before the evening ended, she intended to reveal it. As Claire finally made her way across the ballroom toward her ex-husband, conversations stopped once again. Guests watched carefully, some expecting confrontation, others expecting revenge, many hoping to witness drama. What happened next was something nobody predicted. Because when Claire finally stood face-to-face with Ethan Walker after all those years, the first words that left her mouth changed everything. The ballroom became so quiet that the soft music in the background suddenly felt louder. Dozens of conversations had stopped. Guests who moments earlier had been laughing and celebrating now watched from a distance. Waiting, wondering, expecting a confrontation years in the making. After all, what else could this be? A betrayed wife, a public reunion, a wealthy ex-husband, an audience. Every ingredient for revenge was standing in the same room. Even Ethan seemed prepared for it. As Claire approached, he straightened his posture. His expression remained composed, but there was tension beneath it. The confidence he had carried throughout the evening wasn't quite as strong anymore. For the first time that night, he seemed uncertain, because the situation had unfolded very differently from what he imagined. Claire wasn't supposed to arrive looking successful. She wasn't supposed to know people more influential than the guests he had invited. She wasn't supposed to walk through the room with complete confidence. Most importantly, she wasn't supposed to look happy. Yet there she was, standing directly in front of him, calm, collected, unshaken. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Years of history hung silently between them. The marriage, the betrayal, the divorce, the pain, the rebuilding, everything. Then Claire finally broke the silence. Ethan, thank you. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Thank you? Some wondered if they had heard correctly. Others leaned closer, trying not to miss a word. Even Ethan looked surprised. Of all the things he expected Claire to say, those words weren't among them. What? He asked quietly. Claire smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not a sarcastic smile. A genuine one. The kind that comes from someone who has already made peace with the past. You heard me, she replied. Thank you. For a moment Ethan simply stared, unable to understand, unable to process what was happening. Claire continued. You spent years believing you ruined my life. The room remained silent. You spent years believing I was the one who lost. She paused. And for a while, I believed that too. The honesty in her voice caught people off guard. There was no bitterness, no hostility, just truth. The divorce hurt. The betrayal hurt. Losing people I trusted hurt. There were days I thought I'd never recover. Ethan looked down briefly. For the first time that evening, he seemed uncomfortable. Not because of what Claire was saying, because of how she was saying it. She wasn't speaking like a victim. She wasn't speaking like someone seeking justice. She was speaking like someone who no longer carried the weight of the past. Then Claire delivered the words nobody in the room expected. If you hadn't left, I never would have discovered who I really was. A murmur spread through nearby guests. Some looked at Ethan. Others looked at Claire. Everyone listened. For years, I built my life around supporting your dreams. I believed my purpose was helping you become successful. I believed my future depended on your choices. She paused again. But when you walked away, something unexpected happened. I finally had to build a future of my own. The room remained completely still. Every person present could feel the shift. This wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about business. It wasn't even about the divorce anymore. This was about identity, about growth, about discovering strength after heartbreak. Claire looked directly at Ethan. If you hadn't made the choices you made, I would still be living a life that was never truly mine. The words landed harder than any insult could have. Because insults create defenses. Truth creates reflection. For the first time in years, Ethan was being forced to confront a reality he had spent a long time avoiding. The woman standing before him wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. She wasn't surviving. She was thriving. And she had done it without him. Then Claire revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The secret she had protected throughout their marriage. The secret that had shocked everyone earlier that evening. You always thought I came from nothing. Several people glanced toward Ethan. You never cared enough to ask where I came from. You never cared enough to understand why I lived the way I did. Claire's voice remained calm. My family had more money than either of us could have spent in 10 lifetimes. The room became even quieter. If I hid it, it wasn't because I was ashamed. It was because I wanted someone to love me for who I was. Not for my last name. Not for my family's wealth. Not for what I could provide. For me. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. Because suddenly he understood something devastating. The woman he had dismissed. The woman he had underestimated. The woman he had betrayed. Had never needed him. Not financially. Not socially. Not professionally. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, Ethan had chased status. Chased wealth. Chased validation. All while walking away from someone who already possessed everything he spent decades pursuing. Yet somehow, that wasn't the most painful realization. The most painful realization was this. Claire's success had very little to do with her inheritance. The fortune explained the wealth. It didn't explain the woman she became. That transformation came from something else entirely. Discipline, resilience, courage, character. The very qualities he failed to appreciate when he had the chance. And in that moment, Ethan understood the difference between the two paths they had taken. He spent years trying to prove he had won. Claire spent years building a life. Only one of them succeeded. Eventually, the conversation ended. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Not with humiliation. With closure. The kind of closure few people ever receive. Claire shook his hand gently, then turned toward the exit. As she walked away, guests stepped aside almost instinctively. Some nodded respectfully. Others smiled. Many simply watched. Because they knew they had witnessed something unusual. Not a victory. Something far more meaningful. Freedom. Across the ballroom, Ethan remained exactly where he was. Watching. Thinking. Remembering. For the first time in many years, there was no audience to impress. No story to control. No narrative to shape. Only the truth. And the truth was impossible to escape. The woman he once considered ordinary had become extraordinary. The woman he underestimated had surpassed every expectation. The woman he believed would never recover had built a life stronger than the one she lost. As the ballroom doors closed behind her, Ethan finally understood what everyone else had already begun to see. Claire Bennett had become everything he said she would never be. And by the time he realized it, she was already gone. When people hear stories like this, they often focus on the wrong ending. They focus on the money, the inheritance, the investments, the business success, the ballroom, the luxury car, the shocked expressions. But none of those things are what truly mattered. Because if Claire's story teaches us anything, it's that success isn't always about getting even. Success isn't always about proving someone wrong. And success isn't always about having the last word. Sometimes success is becoming someone your past can no longer control. For years, Ethan Walker controlled the narrative. He controlled how the divorce was perceived. He controlled the image he presented to the world. He controlled the assumptions people made about Claire. But there was one thing he could never control: what Claire chose to become afterward. The truth is, Claire's greatest victory wasn't building wealth. It wasn't discovering opportunities. It wasn't earning respect from influential people. Her greatest victory happened long before she entered that ballroom. It happened the moment she stopped allowing someone else's opinion to determine her worth. It happened the moment she stopped measuring herself by what she had lost. It happened the moment she decided her future would no longer be defined by betrayal. That's when her life truly changed. And perhaps that's why the ending feels so powerful. Because deep down, most people have experienced some version of Claire's story. Maybe not the divorce. Maybe not the betrayal. Maybe not the public reunion years later. But most people know what it's like to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to be judged by someone who never saw their full value. And most people know how difficult it is to rebuild after disappointment. That's why this story resonates. Not because of the wealth, because of the resilience. Not because of the inheritance, because of the transformation. And now, if we go back to where this story began, everything suddenly makes sense. The ballroom went silent. Not because Claire arrived. Not because she was wealthy. Not because of the luxury vehicle waiting outside. Not because of the clothes she wore. And not because of the powerful people who knew her name. The room went silent because everyone was witnessing something rare. The confidence of a person who had lost almost everything and rebuilt anyway. The strength of someone who survived betrayal without becoming bitter. The presence of someone who no longer needed validation from the people who once doubted her. That was what people noticed. That was what made them stare. And that was what Ethan finally understood as he watched Claire walk away. The woman he underestimated was never weak. He simply failed to recognize her strength until it was too late. Sometimes the greatest comeback isn't becoming richer than the people who hurt you. Sometimes the greatest comeback is becoming happier than the person you used to be. And Claire Bennett had done exactly that. So now we'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Claire's position? Would you have ignored the invitation completely? Would you have attended the event and confronted Ethan in front of everyone? Would you have chosen revenge? Or would you have done exactly what Claire did and simply moved forward with your life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And here's another question. Do you think Ethan truly regretted his choices by the end of the story? Or do you think some people never fully understand what they've lost until it's gone forever? Share your opinion below because we'd love to read your perspective. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of resilience, redemption, second chances, and unforgettable life lessons. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure you stay tuned. Because the next story might completely change the way you think about success, relationships, and the people we often underestimate. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.